Horror Noire is a documentary that came out recently on Shudder, the horror streaming service run by AMC Networks. The description of the film on Shudder is delving into a century of genre films that by turns utilized, caricatured, exploited, sidelined, and finally embraced them. Horror Noire traces the untold history of Black Americans in Hollywood through their connection to the horror genre. Adapting Robin Means Coleman's seminal book, Horror Noire will present the living and the dead, using new and archival interviews from scholars and creators, the voices who survived the genre's past trends, to those shaping its future. A Shudder original. I was struck by the very first lines of this movie, spoken by author and academic Tananarive Due.
We've always loved horror. It's just that horror, unfortunately, hasn't always loved us.
So, right off the bat, you learn that this movie is told from the point of view of Black spectatorship, and that it isn't a dismissive or inherently adversarial point of view of horror films, but rather one of both admiration and desire for representation and connection, with the understanding that that representation has often been less than ideal. This is absolutely 100% a film about, as, of course, the title suggests, Black horror. And it's told from so many different angles. Black representation, Black spectatorship, the intersections of real-life mistreatment of Black people and how Black people are represented on screen. Films that perpetuated racism and showcasing beyond harmful stereotypes. Birth of a Nation being state-sanctioned racist propaganda is discussed. And films that explored Black pain and brought wider representation and understanding of oppression to audiences. The back-and-forth historical context and film response or social response to films or etc. is so densely woven in horror noir. As Due says at one point in the film, Black history is Black horror. The description mentions archive interviews, but those are barely used. The vast majority of subjects interviewed in horror noir are literally positioned in a theater, as spectators, commenting not necessarily on a specific film playing in front of them, though the film insinuates that they are at times literally watching a movie and commenting on it, which is kind of weird, but rather on film's history as a whole, and expressing their experiences of filmmaking and of spectatorship and of film fandom as Black people. I really appreciated the fact that there's a huge variety in who was chosen to be interviewed for this movie. Actors, directors, academics, and vocal critics and fans and experts are all given a platform and all have valuable insight. Sometimes contradictory insight, or insight from very different points of view, which added to the density and thoroughness of horror noir. Of course, someone who starred in a role a critic or academic sees as perpetuating stereotypes or harmful ideas could have a different take on the role and its value versus that critic or academic, whether social value or value that came down to a job and a paycheck. I'm not going to go through every film I'm a fan of that is covered in this movie, but everyone I wanted to see talked about was talked about. And just being American and being aware of American history and being a film and horror buff, I was familiar with a lot of what they mentioned, but certainly not all of it, or even necessarily a majority of it. There are so many titles mentioned, and so many different eras and perspectives touched on. Additionally, if you're not super aware of the history of mistreatment of Black people in America in particular, this film isn't going to in and of itself rectify that, but it does touch on so much of that experience, and the accompanying trauma and anxieties that stem from it, and how they manifest in film, and how horror film can represent those anxieties, and offer a particular solidarity and a particular catharsis for Black viewers. I was already aware of all of the historical context presented, but as a white person who is far from an expert on Black horror, I had not fully considered a lot of Black horror films as examined through the particular historical lenses of the Black experience and point of view. As discussed in the film, movies about forced scientific experimentation, whether schlocky or not, take on a different meaning when involving Black bodies. When you consider the historical context of the Tuskegee experiments, and other instances where Black people were considered disposable guinea pigs. The film is arranged chronologically and goes decade by decade, providing both a historical context and exploring Black horror films of each time period, never shying away from the ugliness of how Black people have been treated, or in the massive fluctuations in the quality of their representations on screen, but also not being afraid to engage in sincere triumph and excitement at both problematic but fun or inspiring films, or what those interviewed see as massive shifts in a positive direction, like Get Out. Just generally, there's plenty of room for nuance and serious, sincere examination in this movie, which is wonderful, and is not something horror documentaries are always great at. I can only imagine how difficult it was not only to cut down and edit together interviews covering over 100 years of film history, but to do that from so many different points of view. Even when talking about one specific film, an actor, director, college professor, and critic all have a very different relationship with that film. Lots of actors talk about how black representation in horror films inspired them in their own careers, and those moments and other moments of excitement expressed at wins for black representation and steps forward coming from so many different perspectives are a joy to watch.
Black films hold a mirror up to society, but at the same time give an audience an escape.
Overall, the sitting in a theater approach worked well, though at times felt a little strange or forced. I also watched this movie with closed captions on, and there was an issue where some of what was said in the captions was labeled as inaudible, when to me, as someone who has done transcription work for money, it was really easy to tell what they were saying, and those instances should not have been marked as inaudible. Also, I've watched a handful of broad stroke horror documentaries, and this is definitely one of the best, if not the best, I've seen. No moment is wasted. But one downside in such a massive exploration of films and their contexts from so many points of view is that I ended up feeling like this would have worked better as a miniseries than as a standalone documentary. I'm not saying that that was necessarily a viable alternative, but there wasn't really any time for individual interviewees and their stories, and individual deep dives on eras or on films or longer form interviews could have produced deeper and more complex articulations of ideas that for time reasons had to be kind of glossed over here. I also just really liked it and wanted more of the film and more interviews and more information. And just like honestly, any movie that talks about Attack the Block and Ganja and Hess and has Keith David interviewed in it is going to be something I'll watch and be excited about. And on top of that, it was just a really solid, engaging documentary, and overall, I really enjoyed it, and I would highly recommend it, whether or not you're a big horror fan like I am. Especially if you're not, because it's one of the best representations of horror fandom and the social value of horror film that I've ever seen. Like I said, Horror Noire is up on Shudder. You can probably get a free trial. If not, I think it's $5 a month, which is a pretty good deal for a decent horror streaming service. I haven't used it a lot, but I'm glad that I have it. If you enjoyed this and you want to support my work, I have a Patreon and a Ko-fi. Links in the description. And thank you for watching.